Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I'm thinking about scale. Have you ever wondered why miniature worlds feel larger than life? Why small things pull us in so completely? Today, I want to explore how scale shapes the way we see, feel, and remember. It isn't only about painting and building techniques. It's also about the presence these small creations have. Miniatures can shift perception, alter our state of mind, and even stir a kind of reverence. Miniature work, whether we're building it or just taking it in, does something curious to the mind. It shifts our sense of scale, our attention, how we experience space, how we remember things, even how we feel awe. So here's what I'm asking today. Why do tiny things linger in our minds? Why do they often feel so private, almost sacred? We'll explore research, philosophy, and psychology, and peek through a few small windows into history to explore what happens when we enter the world of the miniature. Let's start with a simple question that gets more complicated the longer you think about it. Why do small things fascinate us? Across history, culture, age, and gender, there is a consistent human pull towards the miniature. Miniature temples, votive offerings, Victorian mourning shrines, dioramas, figures, dollhouses, and fantasy terrains. It isn't only about the objects, it's about the feelings they generate. When I look at a miniature, it doesn't feel like the world is smaller. It feels concentrated, like the complexity has been distilled into something I can hold and study. That compression sharpens my attention. It pulls me closer. And for me, making something smaller doesn't make it less important. It usually makes it feel even more significant. The French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, in The Poetics of Space, talks about a phenomenon called intimate immensity. This term really resonates with me. He says miniatures don't just represent space, they create a kind of internal daydream space. The size isn't expansive, but the feeling is. When I look at a compelling miniature, I forget myself for a moment. Time slows. That's the magic I talked about in episode 1. Bachelard goes on to describe how our imagination expands inward, not outward, when we encounter small things. It could be a miniature figure, a dollhouse, a seashell, even a tiny kitchen sink. These objects can invite contemplation. And I think that's what happens when we build or observe a miniature scene. It's not just entertainment. It's more like focused attention. We shrink the world not to simplify it, but to bring it within reach of our hands and of our minds. There's an interesting psychological difference between viewing a miniature and a monument. A monument is something you approach but rarely touch. Miniatures invite closeness. You want to see what's around the corner. Psychologically, this is a shift from what's called the monumental gaze, which is distant, authoritative, to the miniature gaze, which is intimate and imaginative. Small things don't rely on spectacle. They do something quieter. They activate our imagination. Cognitive science offers a useful idea here called embodied cognition. The idea that our minds rely on the body, on movement, touch, and proximity. When we engage with miniatures, that connection becomes especially clear. We lean in close, sometimes holding our breath without realizing it. And you really feel that with miniatures. We use our fingertips like precision tools. It's not like swinging a chisel at a block of marble. It's more like surgery or embroidery, focused, intimate. And this shift in movement, this closeness, literally changes how we think. Neuroscientists have shown that our sensory and motor systems shape how we think. When we crouch in front of a model or lift a tiny object, we're not just observing, we're reshaping our internal sense of space, weight, and attention. For me, painting a 32 millimeter figure feels completely different than painting a 5-foot canvas. The scale changes, not just the work, but the mindset and how I approach the painting process. A 5-foot canvas is not meant to be viewed from 6 inches away, so when I'm painting, I have to step back. A 32 millimeter figure, though, is not meant to be viewed from 6 feet away. I, at most, hold it at arm's length to get the overall view. For me, it's a completely different process. When do we begin to have this fascination with the small? For me and many others, it begins in childhood. Dollhouses, toy soldiers, tiny animals. Developmental psychologists have long studied this. One interesting finding is that miniature play isn't just a stage of development, it's a way of ordering experience. Bruno Bettelheim suggested that miniature environments allow children to symbolically control large and unpredictable worlds. The fire station that fits in your hand isn't scary. The dollhouse where every figure is frozen in place doesn't argue back. Smallness gives emotional control, and control gives confidence. As adults, that impulse continues, not about control, but about how small things hold memory and meaning. I think the miniature has an essence in the object itself that goes beyond just perceived control over something scary. That's just one aspect of the pull of miniatures. Let's return to Bachelard. He writes about the miniature as a refuge of greatness. I discovered Bachelard while researching this episode, and his ideas about space and imagination really stayed with me. Miniature, he writes, is one of the refuges of greatness. Miniatures allow us to fold space inward, to discover vastness within rather than around. When we look into a perfectly constructed miniature, a scene the size of a shoebox with the right proportions and lighting, we feel something. That's intimate immensity. We are both bigger than the scene and smaller than its meaning. A miniature at its best is a paradox. Tiny in form, immense in meaning. Miniatures often recreate those protected, hidden spaces Bachelard loved. Corners, drawers, attics. They're daydream machines. One of those hidden spaces I loved as a child was the fantastic closet that my grandmother stored coats, shoes, boxes of knickknacks in. It was such a wonderful place, tucked away and filled with treasures to play with. That closet was my daydream machine. And daydreams, Bachelard says, are where the poetic imagination takes flight. That's what he meant by intimate immensity, vastness measured not by size, but by feeling. Miniatures collapse space and distance until we're immersed in something vast, not because it's towering, but because it's deeply focused. That sense of awe overlaps with what psychologists call the small self effect. When we feel awe, we feel small, not diminished, but liberated. Miniatures can do that. Not always, not every piece hits that note, but when one does, it reminds us awe doesn't have to come from cathedrals or mountaintops. Sometimes it fits in the palm of your hand. To get a better understanding of what smallness can do, not just technically, but emotionally, we can look at some artists who build in miniature. Thomas Doyle creates post-apocalyptic domestic scenes, houses ripped from foundations, couples fleeing disaster, all encased in glass bell jars. The scale is so small, you feel protective. Yet the destruction feels intimate. Smallness in Doyle's work becomes a vehicle for emotional ambiguity, a disaster you can carry in your hand. The duo of Laurie Nix and Kathleen Gerber build hyper-realistic dioramas of decaying spaces, empty libraries, ruined malls. The work is technically masterful, but they do something clever. They photograph the scenes at angles and with lighting that makes them look full scale. The trick is in the reveal. You first assume it's real, then you find out it's miniature, and that's where the awe kicks in. The power isn't only in the smallness itself, but in how it hides that fact from you, long enough to let the illusion take hold, and then once revealed, you have to reframe everything you just felt. That process, that flicker between belief and understanding, is what gives the work its psychological power. In Japan, artist Tatsuya Tanaka has built a cult following by crafting daily miniature scenes using household objects. Cotton balls as clouds, hairbrushes as staircases, sushi rolls as subway cars. He creates scenes from modern life, humorous, clever, and at times surprisingly touching. Tanaka's work isn't about realism, it's about recognition, seeing the familiar made strange and vice versa. And that's another kind of smallness, the smallness of daily life blown up through metaphor. In London, street artist Slinkachu places tiny hand-painted figures in public spaces, often in situations of irony or isolation, and photographs them before leaving them behind. A man fishing in a crack on the sidewalk, a woman trying to cross a puddle the size of a lake, a protest rally made up of ants and people with signs no one will ever read. These scenes critique modern loneliness, environmental neglect, urban disconnection, and they do it through smallness, not as nostalgia, but as a social scale commentary. The smaller the figure, the more we feel their vulnerability. In each of these cases, the miniature isn't just a format. It's a lens, a way to engage with big themes, grief, decay, absurdity, alienation, in a way that invites intimacy instead of distance. I want to turn the lens a little now and talk about how the brain deals with smallness. Human perception is relational. We judge size by context, not absolutes. When we talk about scale and perception, it's more than just about measurements. We're talking about how our brains make sense of size in the first place, and how easily that sense can be tricked. Take the Ames room, for example. It's a room built on a slant with warped walls and tilted floors. But from a fixed point of view, your brain sees a normal room. So when someone walks from one side to the other, they appear to grow or shrink. A person becomes a giant or child-sized, not because they changed, but because the room did. And that's what miniatures do. They manipulate context. They compress perspective. They create a frame where small becomes vast and ordinary becomes strange. And our brains fill in the rest. That's why illusions like the Ames room can fool us so easily. And it's why miniatures can trick the brain into feeling real if the proportions and cues are consistent. But there's more going on under the surface. When we look at small, complex objects like miniatures, our visual system activates different neural pathways than when we look at large open spaces. Specifically, the part of the brain that helps us recognize details, what scientists call the what pathway, lights up. We focus with the very center of our vision, what's called foveal vision, the part that helps us focus on tiny details. Studies show that this kind of visual processing increases memory encoding and emotional salience because the brain treats the scene as something significant. To put this another way, when we observe miniatures, the brain works harder, and what we see often sticks longer in memory. But there's something else at play that is just as interesting. The perceptual switch that happens when we move from observer to imagined participant. We engage in spatial embodiment, mentally stepping into the scene. That's why a well-made miniature feels like a place, not an object. And places, as we know, are where memory lives. Think about how many childhood memories are hazy. But can you still recall the layout of your childhood home? I know I can. And I haven't seen it or been inside for decades, but I remember the layout vividly. Spatial memory is one of the most powerful cognitive forms of memory we have. If you're familiar with the Sherlock Holmes series from a few years ago, you may remember the concept of the memory palace. That's why it's so powerful, because the method of remembering things is spatial. But scale isn't only a matter of neurons and optics. It's also shaped by what cultures value and what it overlooks. Different societies have treated miniature objects with reverence, ritual, or resistance. Let's look at 3 examples. The first is what is known as the sacred small. In many traditions, small objects hold spiritual power. Think about Christian reliquaries for the bones of saints, or Japanese kamidana, which are household altars. These things compress the divine into something approachable without fear. Next, we have the subversive small. Smallness has also challenged power. Indian court miniatures with subtle critiques, Miriam Shapiro's dollhouse, or Laurie Simmons' doll photography used to critique domestic labor and gender roles. The Chapman brothers' dioramas, which comment on violence, war, and moral hypocrisy. The small space becomes a stage for rebellion, a way to say big things quietly. And finally, we have the domestic small. Women's craft work, sewing, embroidery, quilting, long dismissed as decorative, holds immense skill and narrative power. When we build in miniature today, dollhouses, terrain, figures, we reclaim the miniature as strength. Small doesn't mean weak, it means deliberate. The small is not a limit, it's a way of seeing things. Let's return to memory. One of the most powerful psychological effects of miniatures is their ability to activate memory, especially episodic memory, that personal, time-stamped kind of remembering that carries facts and feelings. There's a well-documented phenomenon in cognitive psychology research called boundary extension. It refers to our brain's tendency to remember more of a visual scene than we actually saw. Show someone a photo of a small room, and later they'll remember it as larger. Their brain quietly fills in the edges, a hallway, maybe a window that never existed. When I look at old photos of rooms I knew well, my brain fills in everything beyond the frame. At least that's what I think. Though learning about boundary extension makes me wonder if all of what I'm remembering was real or if I'm making up some of it. That's what happens with dioramas. When we become more than just the observer, we imagine what's beyond the walls, where the story goes next. Miniatures don't just hold memories, they help generate them. It prompts us to simulate stories, imagine places, and recover personal associations from the past. This may be why souvenir shops are so popular. People can pick up a miniature-sized version of an attraction or place they have just visited so that they have a replica of a memory they have just experienced. Memory brings us inward, but awe often does something else. It lifts us outward. Let's talk about awe. Awe is one of the most mysterious and compelling human emotions, often described as a mix of wonder, reverence, and a slight fear of the unknown. We think of it in cathedrals and mountains, but psychologists Keltner and Piff show that awe can arise from the small, anything that defies our mental frame. It can be a galaxy or a perfectly painted miniature face. Awe reminds us that we're wired to respond to certain patterns of scale and complexity. Miniatures can trigger that response. When I'm at a show, it's often dioramas that hold my gaze the longest. There's something so visually magnetic about them, so full of wonder compressed into mere inches. So when we build or observe miniatures and we feel that internal hush, that feeling that we're touching something bigger through something smaller, it's not mere sentiment. It's actually rooted in neuroscience. And miniature scenes at their best hit that configuration precisely. We've talked a lot about perception, but what about creation? What happens in the mind and body when we're the ones building the small? There's a state known as flow, defined by psychologists as that feeling of being so absorbed in a task that time just disappears. Your sense of self softens. You're not thinking about success or failure. You're just doing. Miniature work is almost designed to produce flow. It's precise, repetitive, visually absorbing. It requires just enough challenge to stay engaging, but not so much that it feels overwhelming. When we hit that flow state, the part of the brain that's always talking, always worrying, finally quiets down. The inner critic steps back. You stop narrating every move, and for a moment, you just exist in what you're doing. One of the things that fascinates me about miniature painting and model building is that it's not just about what we see. It's about what our hands learn over time. Neuroscientists call this procedural memory, but most of us know it as muscle memory. It's the same kind of memory that lets you type or stir a pot without thinking about every step. And sometimes you find out when you're trying to show someone else something that you know how to do without even thinking about it, that automatic ease seems to disappear. And then you realize just how much your body is doing on its own through repetition. That connects beautifully with an interesting study I read in Frontiers in Psychology. Researchers Monica Giori and Giulio Sandini found that painters simulate a brushstroke before they make it. They rehearse the motion in their minds. Over time, those rehearsals become motor programs in our brain. So gestures that once felt awkward eventually flow without thinking. I think this is why when we first start out painting and building models, it can feel difficult. But years later, those processes seem more natural. For me, painting, whether it's a miniature figure or a canvas, brings this home. I couldn't map out every micro movement if I tried. My hands just seem how to know how to dip the brush in paint without even thinking about it. I've always been drawn to miniatures, but I've started to wonder why that pull never faded. Maybe, as research suggests, something deeper responds to smallness itself. From episode 1, you might remember the tiny kitchen sink that ran water. I built log cabins with Lincoln logs, spent hours with miniature animals. But as an adult, the first diorama that mesmerized me was Dave Brown's Lincoln Memorial. Inside was a sculptor's studio, a paradox, a man creating something larger than himself, all in miniature. That scene hit every psychological note I've talked about: attention, awe, memory. Think about your own experience. Do you remember the first miniature that stopped you in your tracks? Scale is about attention. It's about presence. A miniature isn't just showing us a fantasy world. It shows us how to see in a different way. When we talk about smallness in art, we're really talking about relationship between viewer and object, maker and material, imagination and memory. Smallness says, slow down, come closer, look again, look more carefully. Even people outside the hobby seem drawn in by miniatures. I've never shown someone a miniature that was dismissed as a toy or uninteresting. In a culture obsessed with scaling up, miniature work does the opposite. It compresses meaning into something that demands care and attention. If there's one idea I want to leave you with, it's this: scale is never neutral. Size shapes experience, emotionally, mentally, and physically. The monumental overwhelms, the miniature invites, and in that invitation, we change. We draw closer, we slow down, we begin to see differently. A diorama can hold more than a scene. It can hold a memory. A figure can hold more than paint. It can hold a moment. Smallness isn't a limit. It's a way of tuning the world to attention, to care, to wonder. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into scale, smallness, and perception. I know this episode was a little denser, a little more philosophical, but I think that's the beauty of miniature work. It holds more than it shows on the surface. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, follow, or just carve out a little time to listen. I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in my hand, story waiting. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, not obediently, and keep your story your own. And as always, thanks for listening.